Hello, I'm Bob Cialdini, a behavioral scientist and author of the book Influence, as well as the new book Persuasion. And I'd like to tell you about a series of video interviews I've conducted with individuals who I admire and who have written about behavioral science not just for the academic community, but as well for the larger community. Individuals such as Dan Ariely, Adam Grant, Amy Cuddy, and Richard Thaler. In this series of interviews called Cialdini Asks, I try to get beneath the surface and behind the scenes, inquiring into the motivations that spurred the work of these individuals and their decisions to write about it for a popular audience. I also ask them about aspects of their work that exceeded their expectations in terms of impact, as well as those aspects of their work they felt have been most underappreciated. I even asked them to tell us a funny story or revealing one that nobody knows about them and their work. I know that in the process, I have been surprised, fascinated, and informed by their answers. I hope that the same will be true for you. So I do hope that you will look out for and tune in to the Cialdini Asks video series as we make it available online over the next several weeks. Thanks. Hi, Adam.
Hey, Bob. Great to see you.
You as well. You know, one of the bases I employ to select people for this interview series involves not just the contributions they've made to behavioral science with their research, but also how they've extended the reach of behavioral science beyond the academic community to the larger community. And you've done that with a pair of terrific books, Give and Take first, and then more recently Originals, both of which I read cover to cover at one sitting.
Oh no, I'm so sorry.
I couldn't get enough of it, really. Now, I have my own reasons for wanting to share behavioral science with the non-academic reader. And I wonder what yours might be. That is, what were the factors that spurred you to take that particular direction?
Well, let me start by taking you back to 1999. I was a freshman in college. I was taking a writing seminar on social influence. And the assigned reading for the seminar was a book called Influence on the psychology of persuasion. I think you might have read it a few times because you wrote it. And I was just riveted that you could take all of these principles that I didn't even realize had affected my life over and over again and explain them using social science. And I started telling all my friends and my family about the book, and they got tired of it at some point. And at the same time, I was taking an intro psychology class. And your book was assigned for that class too. And I loved it so much that I read it both times. And I was just hooked. I mean, honestly, your work was what first piqued my interest in social science. And I love the way that you combined the ability to explain the weird things that had happened in our lives and, you know, the barriers to our own success and happiness, but also were able to teach us how to do better. And I thought that the great social science ought to live in and both generate fundamental understanding, but also real applied insight. And I decided I was going to do that. And really, when I got to grad school, I forgot about it because I got busy with publishing. And a few weeks after getting tenure, I started realizing that I had a responsibility to live up to try to share these ideas outside the ivory tower. So it's all your fault. Here we are.
Well, you know, I didn't expect that, but that's very gratifying to hear. That's terrific. But let me ask the first substantive question that I like to ask in these interviews. And once again, let me begin by saying I'm a big fan of your research, but I was especially taken with a study of yours showing that putting a small sign in examination rooms reminding doctors that washing their hands would reduce their chance of getting an infection had no effect on their hand washing. But a sign reminding them to wash their hands because it would reduce their patient's chance of getting an infection, increased hand washing by 45%. What was the impetus for that study? That is, what was the insight or experience that led you to want to do that particular study?
It was a combination of things. So one of the ways, Bob, that your work has really influenced me is it's shown me the power of small interventions to have a large impact. And when I started graduate school, I knew I wanted to do field experiments where we could make relatively minimal changes to people's environments, but produce a pretty dramatic effect on behaviors that mattered. And I'd been working on this in a couple of settings. And then my wife was pregnant. We were expecting our first child, and we went into the hospital, and I saw these signs on the wall that said things like, gel in, wash out. And even worse, here are the 12 steps to wash your hands. And I'm thinking, this is not a how-to problem. It's a why-to problem. Especially doctors and nurses and anybody who's been trained as a healthcare professional, they know how to wash their hands, right? The problem is they're busy and they're not sufficiently motivated to do it. And a colleague of mine, Dave Hoffman, had been studying safety behaviors like this, and we'd been looking for an excuse to do a project together. So while we're waiting for our daughter to arrive, I shot him a quick email and said, I think these signs are terrible. We ought to do something about it. And part of the instinct was that, you know, people obviously are willing to do a lot of things for others that they wouldn't do for themselves, right? You've observed this your whole career, that there are times when immediate self-interest is not sufficient, but knowing the consequences of your actions for others is something that focuses your attention and brings you a sense of meaning. But we also thought that we had this basic assumption that people are unwilling to hear that their own health is at risk. There's a lot of research on the defensive processing of health messages and how people say, no, but I'm a doctor, I'm protected. Or, you know, in some cases, well, you know, I'm in a hospital a lot, I'm exposed to a lot of diseases, but I rarely get sick. So either I had a superior immune system to begin with, or now I've acquired one. And, you know, either way, it's going to fall on deaf ears. Whereas you can't deny that a patient is vulnerable. And so we thought maybe if we posted a sign reminding people that patients could get sick, they would stop and wash.
What I love about that is that it's a reminder, that recognition that patients can get sick and that commitment to the welfare of the patients was in there all along. What you did with that sign was simply bring it to consciousness. And that was the trigger for this remarkable 45% increase in hand washing, something that had been a barrier in hospitals that various administrators were trying to climb because physicians weren't washing their hands. This one little thing that you touched on made that difference. I thought that was really instructive. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I never quite thought about it that way, but you're right. It's in some sense, it's another example of consistency and commitment. That it's a group of people who have a core set of values around protecting patient health and preventing diseases, and we're just calling that to attention and making it salient for them again. And I don't think it's unique though at all to that setting. We've seen for years that some of the most effective ads to get parents to buckle up when driving cars are not the ones that remind them to buckle up for themselves. They're the ones that say buckle up for your kids.
Right. Terrific. Let me move on to another question that is one that somebody once asked me, and it produced what I thought was instructive reflection on my part. It was, of all the work you've done, what would you say has been most underappreciated? And why do you think that is?
My instinct is to reject the premise of the question because it assumes that there's some work that deserves to get more attention than it has. And honestly, I don't think it's my place to judge whether that's true. I do think, though, that you've experienced this for a long time, that there are certain ideas that catch on. And when they become popular, sometimes that does obscure other ideas that you might think are equally important. And I guess, as I think about that, I think that the one that stands out for me is my favorite experiment that I've done in my whole career. is one where I was working with university fundraising callers and trying to get them to actually continue making calls and harassing alums during their dinner and get them to make donations that are so important for student scholarships and occasionally faculty salaries and buildings. And there, a 5-minute interaction with one scholarship student was enough to increase time on the phone by 141% for the average caller per week, and money raised by 172%. And I love that intervention because nobody ever expected that this one 5-minute interaction would make such an impact. And like the hand washing experiment, it was just a small reminder of the good that your work can do. That seemed to really boost people's motivation. And I think a lot of people have maybe overlooked that because it's hard to relate to being a fundraiser. But I think it speaks to something really fundamental about what motivates people and how meaningful it is to know that your work has an effect on the lives of others.
Right. Meaning, very important. And that small intervention hooked to this big motive inside people. And it's like flipping a switch in a stadium that suddenly all the lights go on, right? That flip of the switch just engaged the power of something that was already there in the bowels of the stadium, the utility system there. But the small thing that closed the circuit and made that thing viable now and motivating was the key. It was a trigger. Yeah.
It's a wonderful metaphor, and there's one little puzzle that comes after it, which I'd love to actually get your take on, which is, so we got the big behavior change, right? You see the callers working harder, making more calls, spending more time on the phone. They also tend to use more effective influence strategies, like they're more likely to tell the stories of the scholarship students on the phone when they're allowed. And that translates into more donations raised. The odd thing, though, was I did pre-test and post-test surveys of the callers, and I didn't get significant changes in a series of these experiments on their own reports of meaning or impact or their sense of being valued. It was almost like that light bulb went on, but they never connected the interaction they had with the scholarship students to the change they experienced in motivation. It was like too small for them to admit or notice that was why they were working harder. And I was curious whether you've seen this as well, that you get people's behavior to change, but sometimes the attitude doesn't follow, or at least people aren't aware of it.
That's right, because I think there are so many things going on. They don't recognize that you've changed just one. And that was the key. That's why the behavioral science orientation to the larger community allows us to tell people what works in them, even if they're not recognizing those dimensions that are so powerful, those vectors that are so powerful. We can show them what they are and allow them to undertake behaviors that optimize those particular vectors in their own behavior. Yeah. Well, let me ask a follow-up question. Feel free to reject the premise if you wish. It's the flip side of the earlier one. Of all your work, what has most surprised you in terms of its big impact? Has there been anything that has produced oversized impact relative to your expectations?
Yeah, I think they're probably one of the core ideas in give and take. I didn't expect it to take off the way that it did, but I went in thinking that this framework is obvious, right? The idea that some people are givers, they're generous, some are takers, they're more selfish, and most of us are in the middle as matchers, playing it safe and following the norm of reciprocity. That to me was really clear from the day I started doing this work, and part of that was just from interacting with different kinds of people over the course of my life, and part of it was from reading a lot of social science with different labels that essentially was describing these same differences in value orientations. And the thing that most surprised me about this is how many people have come up with a version of, growing up, my grandmother always told me, there are givers and there are takers in the world. But she forgot to tell me about the matchers, and that's actually the majority of people. That the default instinct is to be fair and reciprocal. And I just found that so odd that people would live in an understanding that people are at the extremes of anything, but especially that people are either generous or selfish, as opposed to just saying, look, most of the time people approach their interactions and say, I'll do something for you if you do something for me. And I just took for granted that everyone knew that. It turns out they didn't.
It strikes me that that's probably because of the conspicuousness of the extremes. Those are the things that we remember, because those are the things that draw our attention. The things that are in the middle that we do most of the time, we kind of gloss over as if they're not really having the biggest impact. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I guess part of the reason that I found the style of matching so interesting is I've had a few conspicuous experiences with matchers that were almost more standout than the givers and the takers. And I guess when that happens, it resets your expectations about what's going to be salient for other people.
Right. Okay. Another question. In your experience as a researcher or author, is there a revealing or humorous story you can tell us that very few people know?
Well, actually, yeah. So one of the matcher stories fits that perfectly.
Yeah.
So I was in grad school. I think it was about halfway through my first year. And I was writing a paper on a topic that was a little bit outside my comfort zone. And I had another student in the program who knew that area extremely well. And I sent an email and said, look, this is an area of your expertise. I was wondering if you'd be willing to take a look at this paper and maybe send me a few comments or suggestions, even some literature to read. And 3 days later, I got an email back, 2 pages of detailed comments, extremely insightful. And I was blown away by how responsive and how generous he was, until I saw the rest of his message, which said, attached is a paper I've written. You have 3 days to send me your comments. And it was one of the oddest, I guess you would call it one of those click whir responses. Like, he helped me, and I had activated this primal instinct that now I owed him not only an equal favor, but in the same exact amount of time.
Right.
And it was so uncomfortable, because I would have been perfectly happy to help. But the fact that he felt that there was some obligation, that he was now entitled to my help, it really kind of it extinguished my motivation to help him at some level. I still did it, but it felt very transactional. It felt like he didn't care about me. He just wanted something from me.
Right.
And it made me realize that the same behavior, guided by different motives, can have very, very different effects on us.
Right. I've always remarked when I speak about the principle of reciprocity and someone has said thank you to us, what we don't ever want to say is, yeah, and you owe me one now. Because that's gonna explode the goodwill that goes with the gratitude associated with having received a generous act. Right.
You know what though? I'm gonna have to try this now just to see what the reaction is. Right. I can't imagine anyone ever saying that unless you're the Godfather.
Right. Here's the last question. As you know, I've recently written a book called Persuasion, which explores what communicators do before delivering a message to increase its acceptance. And I wonder, can you describe a situation in which you've seen a communicator, and it could be you, who said or did something first that led to the success of an immediately subsequent request?
I've been thinking about this one a lot, in part because one of the things that Persuasion really caused me to reflect on is all the things that we do to set the stage for the moments that we want to have influence. And I'll tell you that actually the example that's really stuck with me is a mistake that I made in my own career, which was I was called in by a financial services company to try to help them attract and motivate and retain their junior people. Investment bank people were treated very poorly, and the stars who had lots of other options were jumping ship pretty quickly. And I went in and spent a couple months doing interviews and surveys, and then proposed some field experiments where we could really try to test what worked. And they started arguing about whether they should just change compensation and offer more bonuses, which of course they've done at least 9 times before and hadn't done any good.
Right.
And it was like I was having a conversation with Homo economicus, right? Like, people are only motivated by incentives. That's all there can be. Never mind the data I'd collected showing that the desire to learn and the chance to help clients were the 2 factors that most motivated the majority of the bankers.
Yes, yeah.
And I think I lost it. And I just blurted out, I've never seen smart people act so dumb.
Ooh.
And it was one of those moments, like, what was I thinking? I clearly wasn't thinking. I immediately regretted it. And I got a call about 7 months later from one of the head bankers, and he said, "We've been implementing 6 of the 20-some recommendations that you gave us, and I wanted you to know that the single most important thing that you did was you called us a bunch of idiots." Mm. I'm sorry, I've lost sleep over this. How is this possible? And he said, you earned our trust that you were willing to be honest with us in that situation. And now we want to come back to you and do some more work together. And I guess it's a little bit like the court jester who doesn't get his head cut off. But it was a good lesson in the fact that there was a time and a place to speak really candidly and maybe even a little bit too directly. Because it led this group of people to believe that I was not just giving them platitudes, that I was willing to call a spade, and that was a big aha for me. But I don't know that I'm ever going to word it quite like that again.
No, but I think what you've revealed here is anything you can do that winds up establishing your trust in the eyes of your audience is going to elevate your subsequent influence over that audience. And this is an unusual one. I agree. You may not want to use this in many other kinds of situations, but there are all kinds of ways to elevate trust that people don't think of. Admitting a weakness, for example, early on in their presentation, which we're schooled never to do. We're always schooled to lead with our strengths, get people leaning in our direction before we ever mention a drawback or a weakness in our case. And it's just not what the research shows. There are things that we can do that we wouldn't expect, which establish our trustworthiness, and we've and leveraged our influence subsequently. Yeah.
I'm in complete agreement on that. I will say though that one of those oh shoot moments afterward was what would Bob tell me to do in this situation where I'm trying to have influence? I'm pretty sure you would tell me not to insult the guy that I'm trying to persuade.
Right.
But I guess I got lucky in that situation.
That's right. I would have been wrong, it turns out. But this was great. I genuinely enjoyed our time interacting and learned a bunch of things that I didn't know about you that I think other behavioral scientists and both our followers, sets of followers, would be interested in knowing. So thank you very much for taking the time, Adam.
No, it's a real honor that you asked. And if I can turn the tables on you with one question for you.
Sure.
I would love to know, since writing Persuasion, how has the way that you've lived your own influence attempts changed? Because I feel like we rarely get to hear the author's own experience of what they do differently as a result of what they learned from writing the book.
Yeah. Here's the one that stands out for me. In the book Persuasion, I also talk about the 7th principle of influence, the thing that had eluded me in my recognition of the major motivators that move people in our direction. And I call it unity, the idea that if we can establish for an audience that we are of them, we are one of them, then everything inside the influence process gets easier, right? And so I had a particular situation. I had read this research and I was ready to write about it. And I was also preparing a report that needed to be done the next day. And I had a hole in my data. I didn't have data to make a particular point I wanted, but I knew that a colleague of mine did have those data from a study that he had done. So I called him. He was a sort of an irascible guy on my faculty in the psychology department. And I said, Tom, not his real name, Tom, I'm going to call you. I'm going to call you. I sent him an email to this effect. I'm going to call you and ask you for these data because I'm behind and I have a deadline for tomorrow. So I called him and he said, Bob, I know why you're calling and I'm not going to be able to help. He said, look, I'm a busy man too. I can't be responsible for your poor time management skills, right? So I'm not going to be able to help. Before I read this research about what you do first, right, to establish a sense of unity, I would have said, but Tom, I really need this. This is important to me. Could you help me out? Here's what I said instead. Tom, you know, we've been in the same department now for 12 years. I really need this. It would really help me out. And I had the information that afternoon.
Wow.
I did something first, just as we started our interaction with. Something that was in there. He knew it, that we were part of the same unit, but it wasn't top of consciousness. I just had to establish that first, make that a persuasive context in which to make my request that I really need this, Tom. It would really help me out. And then I got a yes. I don't think I would have gotten a yes otherwise.
Wow, that's fascinating. So you reminded him of his identification with the group, and that made you someone that he actually did feel responsible for.
Exactly. We were colleagues. We were partners. We were part of the same unit. And there were obligations and expectations associated with that that made him want to say yes.
It's fascinating.
Yeah. Great. Okay. Well, I appreciate the insightful question that you asked me. It got me to remember this particular instance. And I'm glad we've had the chance to spend some time together. It was terrific.
Me too. Thanks, Bob.